I quit my job at Stragview Reception Center today. I've been a correctional officer for about a year now, and I find the job exciting and rewarding at times. I had been discharged from the military about 2 years ago for medical reasons, and as the bills piled up and my funds shrank into the double digits, I knew I had to find some work. The state was paying COs good money with excellent benefits, and they generally hire military guys over civilians. I put in an app and started my new and exciting life as a correctional officer within a month. After a few years of yelling at grown men, searching cells, and a mountain of bullshit, I got myself into a little bit of trouble. I'd gotten a bit of a reputation for laying hands on unruly inmates, so when the major called me into his office, I kind of expected it. I had been assured by my fellow officers that I'd get a slap on the wrist, maybe a day or two of administrative leave, and be back to work within a week. What I hadn't expected was 3 months on post as I assessed my attitude and the way I interact with others. For those who don't know, post is about the most boring assignment in all of corrections. You spend your nights in a vehicle, driving around the perimeter, trying not to fall asleep and crash your car into a ditch. It's tedious and unfulfilling work, given to older officers, incompetent officers, or officers in need of a good slap on the nose. I was understandably upset about this development, but as there was nothing I could do about it, I swallowed my pride and prepared for my 3-month stay in purgatory. Had I known what would happen to me out there, I'd have turned in my badge on the spot. I was met at the gate by Sergeant Mathis on what was my first night on post. I'd seen Mathis a few times since I'd started, but I don't think I'd ever spoken to him. Mathis is old even by DOC standards, and he's been riding post for the last 10 years of his career. To hear some of the other officers tell it, he used to be some badass on the compound, but he was sent to post after getting injured and just never came off it. He rides post every night, continuously roving up and down the 2-mile track, never missing a night. He looked about as thrilled to see me as I was to be here. Post may not seem as difficult as working on the compound, but you're the prison's first line of defense in many ways. They've put you on Route 2 tonight, the back line, so just be sure you're ready for 12 hours before you head out. He let his hand slide along the bed of the battered old Ford Ranger, like a rider stroking an old and willing steed. So, what do I do on post exactly? I know I patrol every 15 to 30 minutes, but other than constant patrol, he said, rounding in sudden anger. He got very close to my face before I realized it, and his eyes were huge and staring. I took a few steps back from him, and the side mirror slapped into my back, making me jump. His face was wooden, ghoulish in its intensity, and he seemed on the verge of punching me. He seemed to realize what he was doing, and took a step back. You want to patrol constantly. If you're always moving, then nothing can sneak up on you. Also, make sure you leave your cell phone in the car. I know some of you younger officers think no one will notice if you bring your phone to post, but trust me when I say you don't want any lights out there. No dome light, no headlights. Just use the light poles to navigate, and you'll be okay. I raised an eyebrow at him. Okay from what? He didn't say anything, just ran a hand along the truck near a big dent in the back fender. Okay from what? I asked again, and he seemed to notice me this time as he came back to reality. I had a conversation with a young officer like you once. 3 years ago, he came out to post for a few weeks and didn't think he had to listen to my warnings either. They found his truck out by post 2, out by the sheds, door wide open. Come the morning after, they couldn't raise him on the radio. He wasn't in it. He was nowhere. There was no sign at all. He didn't show up to work the next day. He didn't show up to work any day after that either. He was never seen again. Dude probably got bored and left, I said under my breath. Mathis looked at me sourly. Don't get complacent out there, boy. This isn't the sort of place that forgives complacency. There are things out there that are better kept out of the prison. What things those were, he refused to elaborate on. He just stumped off towards the front and away from me and the idling truck. The first hour and a half was very dull. I watched from the front seat of the Ranger as they fed evening meal, watching the inmates scamper back to their dorm as the daylight began to wane and the night began to creep up. As sundown came, the radio announced restricted movement and concluded any unsupervised strolls across the compound. It was 8 o'clock, only 2 hours into my shift, and I pulled up next to the Post 2 shed and killed the engine. I put my feet up on the dash and pulled out my phone, not caring what some old fart had to say, as I surfed Reddit and checked Facebook. It was a boring post, but I had to admit, it had its perks. As I sat, the sun waning and eventually dying around me, I started to catch something out of the corner of my eye. The compound sat perched on an incline surrounded by thick woods. The woods were a good 50 feet away from the fences, but close enough to make them look menacing, this close to dark. Something kept bounding in and out of them, just off to the left of my line of sight. Once or twice, I thought I caught a glimpse of a dog or something in the side mirror. I shrugged it off and got back to my phone. By the time it was good and dark, it was time for me to make another pass around the perimeter. As I cranked the old truck, it sputtered and died on me. I cursed, twisted the key, and gave it some gas this time to make it sputter to life. They always gave corrections the worst vehicles. I was driving around the little dirt path, trying to keep it on the road, when something big ran in front of the truck. I slammed on my brakes, but it was already gone. It had been on the fence side of the road, running for the woods. I'd only gotten a quick look at it as it loped past. It looked like a big dog, and as I looked towards the woods, I couldn't see anything but the nearly invisible tree line. I was still feeling startled as I pulled back towards the sheds. What the hell was that thing? I had heard that some of the dogs in the area had formed a little dog pack, but this thing had been bigger than the usual mutts you saw in the area. I parked and turned off the engine again, pulling out my phone to clear my head. 10 minutes of social media later, and I had calmed down a little. I hadn't forgotten about the big dog thing, but I decided that I'd blown it out of proportion. It was just a dog, nothing to worry about. When I looked back at the clock, I realized it was already 10 o'clock. I cranked the truck again and was just about to pull out of the road again when something hit the side of my vehicle. I had reached for my monster in the cup holder just before the hit, and I cursed as the drink spilled all over my shirt. I shook the sticky liquid off as I looked behind me, thinking I had clipped the shed somehow. What I saw was a new dent in the back of the truck, and no sight of whatever I had hit. If the dent hadn't been there, I would have thought I had imagined the whole thing. I got out and looked around, but there was nothing to see. Just a dent in the fender, and the oppressive darkness around the shed. After doing my circuit again, I pulled back up to the shed in a pretty foul mood. I felt sticky and miserable. I was covered in energy drink, my ass was starting to fall asleep, I needed to pee like a racehorse. I looked around for a bathroom, but there were no bathrooms to be seen. I wondered where the other drivers went when they needed to go. Probably carried a bottle or something. I looked around fretfully and finally decided to just go behind the shed. It was hidden pretty well, and I doubted anybody would see me. I stepped out of the truck, leaving the door open and the engine running, as I walked behind the shed to do my business. I had barely started when I heard something slam into the side of the truck. A stream of hot piss joined the energy drink on my shirt as I jumped about a mile. I turned to see what had hit the car, just as a second loud crash shattered the passenger side window. I got myself zipped up and rounded the shed, expecting a large dog or a bird. What I found was much worse. Between me and the door, its massive shoulder resting against the dent, was something that was part mountain lion and part nightmare hound. Its skin was midnight black, chitinous plates that creaked when it moved, with a long snout full of sharp teeth that dribbled over its jaws. Its eyes were non-existent, and its feet were home to long, sharp claws that had sliced a line in the side of the Ranger. It turned that eyeless head on me and opened its mouth to loose a loud, angry sound that immediately sent me running. My boots clapped against the dirt road as I ran for my life. As I ran, my mind raced, trying to form a plan that didn't involve trying to out-sprint this thing for a half a mile. I could double back to the car. It wasn't that far away, and there was a radio and a shotgun in there that I could use to call for help and defend myself. No matter how big this thing was, a load of buckshot to the face was likely to leave it in a bad way. Yeah, it probably hadn't left the shed yet. I was sure I could turn around and make it back before I heard it snarl right behind me then, and I didn't have to look to know it was less than a foot away. I sprinted, running flat out, and if I'd fallen, I'd have been dead. I hadn't run far when my back exploded in agony. I wanted to stop, wanted to see how bad it had clawed me, but I knew I had to run. I ran, the spotlights offering me islands of light in the glowing darkness. and as I ran flat out, I heard its heavy footsteps behind me veering out of the light. It didn't seem to like being in the light, and I used this to my advantage, putting on a burst of speed every time I left one of the islands of safety. I could see the curve that would take me around the fence and back into the prison's front area. There would be people there, guards in the control room, doors to hide behind, people that would shoot this thing and let me live another day. That was when I tripped. I fell hard on the dirt, rolling as I fell and covering my head with my arms as I came to a stop. I just knew that it would be on me now, tearing me apart, and I quivered as the seconds ticked by with no ripping pain. Something fell across me then, some bright flash that blinded me, even beyond my closed eyelids. I sat as still as I could in the sand as this new something stopped inches from my head. Then it quieted all at once, and I heard someone ask me what the hell I thought I was doing. I opened my eyes and found the Post 1 vehicle sitting right in front of me, its lights bathing me where I sat. I didn't answer her. I just got up and ran. I ran to my truck, pushed the keys into the ignition, and thundered out of the parking lot like a bat out of hell. My phone rang about 10 minutes later, but I didn't answer it. It's been ringing all night, and I still haven't answered it. I know it's the prison, but I don't care. I'm never going back there again. I'm sitting in the bathtub, my back wound making the water red as I soak up the heat. The cuts on my back are deep, but I don't know where to go to get them cleaned or tended to. I don't know if I ever want to leave my house again. What I saw tonight, I stumbled across something I can't explain. I'm not going back to work, but if you take my place, be sure to listen to that old man when he tells you to continuously rove. If you have to go to post, make sure you follow the rules. Don't stop. Don't bring anything out there that might draw its attention. And don't get out of your car for any reason. Otherwise, they might find your car out at post one morning, after whatever lives in the woods finds you first. I work as a correctional officer in Stragview Prison. Now, saying that probably brings up all sorts of images and ideas, but just know, the job is very different than what you see on TV. There are no nightly escape attempts, no big throwdowns in the yard every afternoon, and if your inmates are drunk, it's usually because they've been smuggling things out of the kitchen for weeks. The night shift is not generally very exciting, but it does have its quirks. For example, all the guards in confinement knew about the mysterious shower in Quad 2. At first it was just a curiosity to help pass the time, a mystery to be solved, or some bit of annoyance that inmates could complain about ceaselessly. No one could have known how bad it would get in the end. I've been an officer in confinement probably since I got certified. There's a real need for male staff at an all-male facility. Shocking, I know, and the confinement unit is no different. Typically the crew is small, each filling a desired need. My temperament was thought to be beneficial in a unit generally occupied by hard asses, and so I was assigned to the unit to fill that role. In the 2 years I've been here, I've seen and heard some things that you don't usually see on TV. I've heard hits planned out through the back grates and the windows. I've had all manner of things thrown at me through the flaps, which we push their food or their clothes in through. I've been called some pretty colorful names. I've stumbled across my fair share of bodies, too, hanging or bleeding, which needed immediate medical attention. Shower 5, though, was definitely the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I couldn't begin to tell you why. I doubt anyone could, but sometimes when you put an inmate in Shower 5, they would reappear in Shower 3. For those unfamiliar with how prison quads are set up, let me explain. Each quad holds 28 cells, 14 on the top and 14 on the bottom, accessible by catwalk. There are 5 showers in each quad. Shower 1 and Shower 5 are on either side of the cells 1 and 14. Shower 2 and 4 are on either side of cell 15 and 28. And Shower 3 sits between cell 21 and 22. We shower 2 quads a night, which roughly takes about 3 to 4 hours, and makes up the biggest part of our night. Quad 2's shower night was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Inmates are cuffed, removed from cells, weighed, given haircuts, and placed in the shower so we can search their cells. They're given roughly 15 minutes to wash and dry off before we come back, cuff them, and return them to their cells. While they're showering, they're locked in a shower cell about the size of, well, a household shower, while we go to the next quad and do pretty much the same thing. Sometimes within that 15-minute window, though, the inmate will close their eyes, to blink or maybe rinse their hair, and suddenly appear in shower 3. At first, it would happen anywhere from 2 to 4 times a month. It was never anything you could count on. We'd sometimes take bets on when it would happen, too. It never happened in reverse, either. Shower 3 was broken, so we never used it. But when we put an inmate in shower 3 for holding, he never went anywhere until we were ready for him to go somewhere. The shower was a mystery that provided a much-needed break from a tedious job. For the first 4 months, we laughed at the look of confusion on the inmates' faces who appeared in shower 3, heads full of shampoo or frantically searching for a towel that wasn't there. It was a fun game, until inmate Ferris disappeared. Inmate Ferris was one of the few who didn't request shower 5 every shower night. The other inmates fought like cats to get that stall, and I'd come into the quad many nights to the sound of them bickering about who would get it tonight or trying to trade their breakfast trays for someone's spot in the line. One inmate, in particular, inmate Garvey, used to sell his breakfast tray for their place in the line if it would get him into shower 5. He showered there 9 nights out of 10, and still never had it happen to him. One night in particular, we had just packed him away and put the next man in shower 5, only to return to find shower 3 occupied, shower 5 empty, and inmate Garvey pouting like an angry child. They all tried, but, in truth, less than half of them ever got to experience it, and none of them got to experience it like inmate Ferris did. When it came time for Ferris to go, he said he wasn't going to go to shower 5. Usually this wouldn't have been a problem. There were always tons of others willing to go in his place. But tonight, Ferris was my last shower. Garvey immediately started hooting about wanting to take his place, but we ignored him. On that night, all I was thinking about was the food waiting for me in the fridge and the prospect of being done with another shower night. There was also the matter of Ferris's smell. Ferris had been refusing his shower for the last 7 shower nights. The other shift didn't quite enforce the rules like we did about bathing once a week, and the administration had begun to notice Ferris's odor. They had sent down the order after their latest inspection that Ferris would shower tonight, on his own or with assistance. "Look, Ferris, you're going in that shower. It's the only one I have available, and you're my last shower." "I ain't going in that shower." He said it evenly as he stared at me through the glass door. Purvis started walking towards us, but I waved him off, not wanting to spook Ferris and create a situation where there didn't need to be one. "Look, Ferris, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you refuse this shower, I can get a bunch of angry men to come down here and pull you out and put you in the shower. Or you could be an adult and go take your shower, and we can be done with this. What's it gonna be?" He argued a bit more, but in the end he put on the cuffs and went to shower 5 meekly enough. I always kinda regret making him go. He was praying when I closed the shower door. He was very religious, and a shower that made people vanish was something he neither trusted nor understood. I closed him in and took off his cuffs. At first I didn't think he was going to shower at all. As I descended the stairs, though, I heard the water start and decided to make a trip to the officer station for a quick bite. The crisis had been averted, and now it was time for a well-deserved reward. 15 minutes later, I returned to find 3 occupied showers and 2 empty showers. Well, not exactly empty. Ferris's towel was still hanging off the door, and his soap dish was still sitting on the ledge. Of inmate Ferris, though, there was no sign. Purvis looked around, not quite understanding what had happened, and wondered out loud if we'd filled all the showers before we left. I said we had, and Purvis and I spent the next hour searching every shower, every cell on the quad, and every cell and shower in every other quad for good measure. We checked the CCTV in the station, but there was no video of him leaving the shower. The video showed him showering 1 minute and gone the next. The strange shower hadn't disappeared Ferris to a different shower this time. It had simply disappeared him. The next 3 days were a nightmare. Ferris's disappearance prompted emergency search of all dorms, a compound-wide lockdown, the dispatching of the K-9 team, and a county-wide manhunt that extended into neighboring counties before it was finally called off after a fruitless 2 weeks. For 3 days, we were questioned, had to make multiple written and verbal statements, and were grilled endlessly by the local and federal officers. The cameras clearly showed that we had been absent from the quad when Ferris had disappeared, so after 3 days, they had no choice but to let us return to work. We weren't sure what to make of the incident, but we chalked it up as the strangeness of shower 5 and went back to work as usual. We didn't use shower 5 anymore, though. It seemed like the strange magic had finally turned sour. We even called in a favor and had maintenance come down to fix shower 3, which meant we still had 4 showers in quad 2. We didn't see Ferris for another 3 months. I've said we a lot in this story, but I haven't really talked about the men I served with in confinement. Purvis was our muscle, 6 feet tall and built like a barrel. I'm pretty sure all the inmates thought he communicated through grunts and the occasional go to hell. If you weren't an inmate, though, he was one of the nicest guys you'd ever care to know. I've spent many afternoons on his back porch with a beer in my hand and the smell of steaks on the grill, chatting with the third member of our trio, McCann, while Purvis grilled. McCann, Sergeant McCann that was a 10-year vet who'd spent most of his time doing paperwork and fielding questions from the brass. He let us handle most of the day-to-day drudgery while he insulated us in a warm blanket of correctly managed reports and accurately maintained logs. McCann was far from what you'd call imposing, standing about 5'2" with thick glasses and a slim frame, but he was knowledgeable about his job and always had something to talk about. He was the last sergeant I ever served with in that confinement unit. 3 months passed and Ferris's disappearance was starting to fade. After the inquiry and the inquest determining whether or not we'd had something to do with the disappearance, they put us back in confinement and told us to keep a closer watch in the future. We talked about it sometimes, speculating on what had happened to him, but ultimately we lost interest after the paperwork ended and the hype died down. He was gone, and we still had a job to do. The showers went on, days turned into weeks. It was Sunday when Ferris finally came back. Sundays were pretty easy in confinement. We didn't do showers on Sunday night. The night was spent cleaning and passing out toiletries and generally just finding something online to watch so we could run out the clock. We brought food in to share most Sundays, and this one was no exception. I brought chicken, Purvis brought soda, and McCann brought a pecan pie his sister had made. By 9 o'clock, we had caught up on our paperwork, passed out our toiletries, and we were full as ticks and ready to find a movie. I had my feet kicked up on the desk and was just getting ready to enjoy a nap when the sound of boots on doors started in quad 2. McCann looked up from the screen and sighed. I knew it was too good to be true. We headed out into the quad to see what all the kicking was about. As Purvis and I came to the door, we were buffeted by the screams of, "Shower 3!" and "It's Purvis! He's dying!" We came up the stairs 2 at a time, and what I saw will haunt me until the day I die. I'd seen men get hurt in the line of work, I'd seen men get stabbed, and I'd watched a few men die, but I had never seen anything to top this level of cruelty. It was Ferris, all right. We'd arrived in time to see his last few breaths and listen to him wheeze as his lungs finished filling with blood. He lay on the dirty shower floor, his blood pooling as it tried to flow into the drain, and shuddered out his last seconds of life. He was naked, and we were saved having to look at his mutilated genitalia because of the fetal position he'd taken. A nurse would later tell us that he had been cut and sliced cruelly before he died, and his stomach and intestines were a mess of punctured tissue. We didn't know about this until later, but what we could see was horrific enough. His skin had been sliced by long claws, and his back looked as though someone had tried to peel him a strip at a time. His arms, legs, neck, face, and especially his back were in bloody tatters, and when he finally died, I considered it a mercy. "Go get the Sarge," Purvis said, and as a man with the shortest time in, I was relegated to the bubble while McCann went to the floor to assess the situation. They took Ferris out under a sheet, and it was dripping red in its wake. This started a whole new bombardment of paperwork. CCTV footage was combed over a frame at a time. Witness statements were taken, and dispositions were written. Luckily, we had done our rounds on time. One of us was on camera not even 30 minutes before he'd appeared in the shower. It was agreed that the incident had been no negligence of ours. The narrative they constructed was an unsatisfying one, but it kept our bacon out of the fire, so we didn't argue. Ferris had managed to worm his way into the grates through the showers and had made it to the ventilation system. The other inmates had likely been feeding him and telling him when to stop moving. This was before audio was normal in the dorms, so we couldn't check to see if they were talking to him. After 3 months, he'd gotten bored and wandered into one of the big fans and gotten cut up. He drug himself back into the shower, shower 3 this time, and called for help. That's where we had found him. No inmates admitted to having talked to Ferris since he disappeared, and no blood was ever found in the vents. But this was a much better narrative than a shower that kept sending inmates from one shower to another. Sometimes, administration just wants paperwork to look good. Making sense was secondary. After that, no inmate would go near Shower 5. It spread the compound seemingly overnight, and any inmate that came into Quad 2 would refuse to go into that shower. We were more than happy to oblige this request. One more weird occurrence and they'd pull us all out and separate us between the other dorms. We all liked being where we were, and we were in no hurry to get sent somewhere else. For the next few months, we kept a low profile and tried our best to keep the disturbances to a minimum. If we needed a reminder of the incident, all we had to do was look at the red stains on the floor of Shower 3, the ones that no amount of scrubbing could get rid of. We managed to keep the weirdness to a minimum for about a month, before it came completely off the rails. Purvis and I were conducting showers in 3 and 4 when they brought in our latest wild child. Everett was what we'd call a frequent flyer. Had we known he was coming in, we'd have put him in the cell we'd just released him from 3 days ago. He'd gotten into another fight, probably over gang politics, and now he was sitting in the sally port again, cussing up a storm. When they asked us where we wanted him, we didn't even think about Shower 5. We told them to just put him in a shower on the other side and we'd deal with him later. I don't know if he said something to them or not, but they later told us that they loaded him into Shower 5, leaving the cuffs on because he was being combative. We finished showers later that night. Just about the time my butt hit the chair, I remembered Everett. I haven't heard a peep out of him. Did they load him into a cell? McCann looked at his board and shook his head. Pretty sure they put him in a shower. A quick look through the glass told us that he wasn't in one of the ground floor showers. How could he be? We had used all the bottom showers to shower other quads. When I asked them why they had put him in Shower 5, they answered that it had been funny to watch him piss his pants in fear of the mystery shower. It was less funny after the events of that night. We were preparing to go put him away when a chorus of screams brought our attention to the quad. Inmates were screaming, terrified wails that only the doomed are capable of, and the whole quad was going nuts. We could all see the door to Shower 5 heaving and buckling as something slammed into it with a machine-like rhythm. That wasn't like any kicking I'd ever heard, and added to the screaming, it put me on edge. Shower 5 had become something sinister, something not altogether understandable, and I did not want to see what new horror it had in store for us. I started to move, despite my apprehension, but McCann stopped me. "I've got this. Call the captain and get some help down here while we see what's going on." His action saved my life that day. Sometimes I wish it hadn't. He and Purvis left the station in a hurry, piling up at the door as they hunted for keys. They came through the door, one behind the other, as they mounted the steps in a flurry of motion. They were at the top of the stairs and heading towards the shower when the door buckled outward. That door was reinforced metal, and whatever was on the other side had separated it from the hinges. The hinge hung lamely, concrete still clinging to it, as something dark and groping tried to climb through the hole. The snapping mouth glistened in the overhead lights as the creature scrambled and pushed to be free of the prison. I saw Purvis take a step back, bumping into McCann as the two tried to process what was happening. All thoughts of calling for help had fled me as I watched the events unfold. The creature freed itself from the hole, black goo glistening on the torn door, and made its way up the wall with a hellish shriek and a metallic clitter I could hear through the glass. The whole quad had started to scream, and their hellish chorus was only drowned out by the creature's scream of pain as it left its glistening trail behind it on the concrete wall. The two officers, my friends, stood like statues as the thing swung its eyeless head from side to side. It seemed to be confused by all the screaming, the sound bouncing off the concrete, and I thought they might escape as Purvis took another tentative step backward. That's when McCann started screaming. I'd seen McCann face the most hardened of inmates, seen him hold the line during the last summer's riots as we held the gate against a dozen screaming inmates. But this creature was too much for him. He screamed, and it cut across the hellish sound of the quad like a knife through butter. The creature then turned its eyeless face towards him, and the front of its bulbous mouth split open to reveal lines of serrated teeth. It loosed a high-pitched sound like a piece of farm equipment stripping its gears, and leapt, coming stickily off the wall. Its path took it straight into Purvis, who was frozen in front of the screaming sergeant. It rode him to the ground, knocking McCann off his feet, and the strange mouth ripped itself open to reveal rows of glistening black teeth. Its mouth dove, and it tore chunks of flesh out of the screaming man as McCann scooted backwards in a state of sheer terror. He reached for his gas, the small can of chemical spray that is usually our best defense against aggressive inmates, but his hand seemed unsure how to break the seal that held it in the holster, or even whether or not he wanted to. The creature, meanwhile, was wolfing down gobbets of the quickly exsanguinating Purvis. Purvis was not a small man. I had seen him lay hands on men who would have given me trouble, and put them on their faces as easily as someone subduing a child. Purvis was straining against the thing as it tore bloody strips out of his shirt, his undershirt, and his chest, but his biceps were losing purchase, and he was starting to weaken. The creature raised its muzzle all at once and bit down on his face, engulfing the man's head in a single bite. As Purvis kicked and thrashed under it, I saw McCann get to his feet and run for it. The catwalk had 2 points of egress, and McCann seemed to think that if he could get to the other side, he could elude the creature and put the solid steel door between them. He almost did it, too, until the creature looked up from the stripped skull it was chewing on and heard him running down the stairs. It leapt, frog-like, and hit one of the overhead caged lights as it swung drunkenly before falling to the concrete with a shower of glass and twisted bars. As it fell, the creature leaped off it and caught McCann in the back as he ran for the door. The door is framed with 2 large glass windows that stand about 25 feet high, so you can glance out at the quad and see what's happening at any given time. The creature slammed into McCann and plastered him against one of these windows like a bug. His nose broke, his glasses shattered, and as he slid down, I could follow his progress with the trail of blood he left. The only thing visible was one hand, spasmodically grasping at the impenetrable barrier between him and his freedom as the creature devoured him. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there with the phone in one hand, dial tone blaring at me, and the radio in the other hand, putting out the same good-natured chatter as it usually does this time of night. It was so weird to think there were people having normal nights somewhere else on the compound. While my 2 best friends were being devoured before my eyes, there were actually people out there having comfortable nights filled with nothing more pressing than a bellyache or an unruly inmate who wouldn't go to bed. It didn't even seem possible that our universe could be in the same plane of existence. I think that's when my mind snapped. Or maybe it was when I looked up from the radio and saw the creature looking at me, its eyeless face staring straight at me, that my mind simply unraveled. I let the phone slip out of my hand, let the radio clatter to the desk, and I simply curled in a ball on the floor. I don't know how long I was there, but when I came back to myself, the captain was shaking me, and all hell had truly broken loose. They had come in after I didn't answer the radio. They had used the emergency keys to come into the station and found me on the ground in a catatonic state. They had looked out to see the blood splattered on the windows and feared that a riot was underway. They had assembled their response team, a 7-man team with riot gear, and proceeded into the quad. As I looked out into the shadowy hellscape, I could see that several of the cells had been opened somehow, and there was a lot more blood on the floor than I remembered. The remains of body armor and broken shotguns lay everywhere, and the lights in the quad seemed to be in a constant state of flicker. The team had gone in and been attacked by what they thought was a mountain lion. They had been ripped to shreds in a matter of minutes. Only the team leader had managed to escape after throwing a flash grenade in the thing's face. It had batted the door a little while trying to get at him, but had eventually gone back to eating the remains of the 6 other members. The team leader said it looked like some of the inmates had been killed, though he couldn't figure out how it had been getting into the cells. They looked to me for answers, but I had none. The team leader joined me in a fetal ball in the corner, while the captain made calls for backup. I sat in that station for the next 2 days, nodding off when sleep finally took me, and watching as the state police and animal control tried to figure out how to get this thing out of the quad. After the 3rd police officer was ripped to shreds, we got a visit from someone higher up. The warden came into the station, looking nonplussed and calm as ever. He had a sit-down with the captain and the chief of the state police, who had made my station his command center. He told us that the quad was to be quarantined until further notice, the reflection on his glasses making him look as inhuman as the creature. No one was to go in or out until this thing was dead. Captain asked him what we should do about the men trapped inside, men who hadn't eaten in 2 days, and he simply shrugged and said if they were in there, then they were as good as dead already. That thing isn't going to let anyone out once it's in there, and a rescue attempt isn't going to do anything but lose you more men. Don't worry, though. We'll make it so no one who's gone through the door ever existed. The warden led the chief out after that, and all the state police went with him. It was just us in our own little world again after that. He was true to his word, too. McCann and Purvis were unmarried bachelors, so they just disappeared one day after work. Of the 27 inmates who'd been in that quad, I don't know. Their files were gone when I came back. Their DC numbers and CDC records expunged, and all the cells were open and empty. The doors to Quad 2 have been sealed shut, the doors welded closed, and caution tape has been draped across it. I was offered McCann's position as confinement sergeant, and I took it. I didn't take it because I wanted it, but because I felt like it was my sacred trust to guard against that thing every night. I've never seen it during the day. It doesn't seem to like the light, but at night you can catch glimpses of it in the darkness as it stalks the rats and roaches that still live out in the quad. The new officers they put back here always ask me what happened in Quad 2, but I never tell them the whole story. If they knew, they might try to get in and get its attention, adding more blood to my hands. I've seen officers come and go in the last 10 years, but I haven't told anyone about the incident. My captain's a major now, at another facility. Everyone from my old shift has either quit or moved on. I alone keep my vigil here every night. Sometimes I see him in the semi-darkness, looking at me, thinking. After 10 years, I imagine he's hungry for something more than rats. Maybe in another 10, he'll question how thick that glass is between him and the real meat. When he does, I'll be here. They tell you not to get too friendly with the inmates. Statistically, 45% of prison staff will have an unwise encounter with an inmate at some point in their career. What this translates to varies from person to person, but in my case, it was a little worse than most. I lost it all, and all because I talked a little too much with an inmate. "Morning, Sarge." That was inmate Howard's usual greeting. He'd been in maximum security for as long as I could remember. He'd been sentenced to life in prison for a string of murders he'd committed against women. He'd gotten himself a cell in maximum security because he'd killed at least 3 roommates. Now he was housed alone, got his meals in a styrofoam tray, and only got rec once a week, and only then under the closest of scrutiny. If ever oh ever there was a bad guy in prison, it was inmate Howard. That being said, I'd never had any trouble out of him. He was always polite. He never sat at the door and ogled nurses when they came to pass meds. He never kicked the door or threw his shit, and was generally well behaved as far as inmates go. He read a lot, never really talked to anyone, and mostly kept to himself. He didn't even really speak to the other COs, except for me. I was the only one that had more to say to him than shut up. His conversations started off light. He was a football fan, and he wanted to know how his team was doing as I passed mail. What sort of movies were in theaters while I handed out lunch? How was I, or how was the health of my family while I pushed around the laundry cart? Standard stuff, conversation starters. Pretty typical of inmates locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. I kept my responses casual at first, 1 or 2 word answers, but after a while, you start getting used to people. Inmates are criminals, they're bad guys, but you see them as often as you see your friends after a while. I was never friends with them, that's never a good idea. You do become relaxed after a while, though. You let your guard down. You start to discuss last night's football game with them. You talk about how the new Judge Dredd movies are so much better than the old ones. You ask them about their families, and you tell them a little bit about yours. You start to look at them like animals in a zoo. The animals are behind bars, and thus no threat to you. You get relaxed. You get comfortable looking and stepping a little closer to the bars than you usually would. You forget that the animals still have claws and horns and teeth. You forget that the animals are still animals. I was sitting at his cell one afternoon, sorting mail and passing a word, when he suddenly told me something that made me look up from my mail sack. I'd gotten comfortable enough talking with him and made a habit of it almost every afternoon. I never spent long out there. just a few minutes of conversation, and we usually talked about the sort of thing he could learn about if he took the time. We had just finished talking about the Cowboys, a team we both liked, and their miserable loss last weekend, when he suddenly asked me if I believed in God. I rolled my eyes, expecting a jailhouse sermon. My God, Howard, don't tell me how you found Jesus in this hellish place. Nope, not sure he even exists. Don't see how he could if he'd give a man like me this condition. Condition? Your condition came from murdering all those women. I don't think Jesus had much to do with that, Howard. No, not that condition. He paused, looking around conspiratorially. Sarge, if I tell you something, will you promise not to tell anyone else? I perked my ears up. It wasn't uncommon to get a cell-side confession from some of these guys. They were hard to a point, but eventually their crimes began to weigh on them at night. So they tell some officer their sins so he can go tell the captain, and he can tell the warden so he can tell the families of the victims, and the victims can get some closure. I didn't know if that's what this was, but I was curious nonetheless. Sure, I promise. He leaned against the glass and whispered into the little ventilator grate. I can't die. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Yeah, good thing they gave you life then. Not being able to die would put a real damper on a death sentence. He looked at me through the glass, and I could tell that he was absolutely serious. I gave him a stern look. There is no way. Get the hell out of here. No one is immune to death, Howard. Howard stepped back into his cell and seemed to ignore me. He sat on his bunk and stared at the floor, and I kept passing mail. There was no way. This was a classic inmate game of see if I can get one over on the CO. Once I bought it, he'd laugh and tell the quad how he'd got me, and they'd all laugh at me too. When I finished his quad, I looked back at his cell, and he was standing at the door again. Howard was wearing the same determined look that I'd seen earlier, and for a moment, I wanted to talk to him and clear things up. If he hurt himself because of this, I could get into some real trouble. I put it out of my mind, though, and went about my routine. It was almost time to leave, and I wanted to be out of the door when 6 o'clock rolled around. Howard didn't bring it up again until the next day. I came around with the lunch trays and noticed that he was standing in the back of his cell. He was naked from the waist up, his chest a tapestry of scars and mostly healed burns, and he was pressing a shank to the spot where his heart should be. I scrambled for my keys as I fumbled for my gas, intending to spray him before he could stab himself. Before I could get the flap open, he had already plunged the knife in. He backed into the wall, his knees giving way as his blood pumped out of his chest. I felt my numb fingers reaching for my radio to call for help. I had just drawn it to my mouth when he hit the door, the hole in his chest already closing, and drug the wet knife across the glass. "Believe me now?" he said, his voice completely even. The radio buzzed to life. Whoever was in the booth must have noticed me hit the door and thought something was going on. I keyed up the radio and told him that everything was okay as I watched the knife slide out from under the cell door and bump my foot. Howard stepped back, hands raised, a big grin on his face like a magician at the end of a particularly good trick. I still insisted that he go to medical. I told them that he had told me about a bad nosebleed, and when the captain saw how much blood was in his cell, he agreed. We shackled him, cuffed him, and took him down the path to medical, his chest and pants awash with blood. I agreed to sit with him in medical, and after the nurse looked him over, we sat in the exam room and waited to be released. That was where he told me the whole story. When I was 6, Dad came home drunk and broke my neck during a beating. I thought I was dead, lying on the floor while Mom screamed between punches, waiting to float off to wherever came next. When I didn't die, I realized that my neck wasn't broken. It had been. I knew it had been, but it wasn't anymore. My mother cried over me, tears streaming out of her raccoon eyes, and that was when I realized that I was different. When I was 16, a cop shot me 3 times in the chest during a robbery. I spent 3 years in juvie, but I was also deemed a medical miracle. I've been stabbed, burned, shot, thrown out of and off of things, and I always come back just fine. I listened to his story, unsure I would believe it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. That's why I wanted to tell you about it, Sarge. When my dad broke my neck, it was 1901. Dad was a coal miner, Mom was a homemaker, and I've seen the rise and fall of a century. I've looked 30 since I was 20, and I'll go right on looking 30 forever if I choose to. The thing is, I'm tired of living. It's a curse to live this long, especially here, and I want to die. There's only one way I can do it, though. He leaned in close, his chains clinking as they kept him strapped to the bed. I have to give this power to someone. I leaned away from him, his breath reeking of unbrushed teeth. And you want to give it to me? I said dubiously. You're always one of the good ones, Sarge. You treat us fairly, like people, and that means something to us. I want you to have this curse. Maybe you can do more with it than I could. I'd be a liar if I said the idea of living forever didn't appeal to me. Having unlimited time to pursue the things I loved, not having to worry about time getting away from me, being able to enjoy life until I was ready for it to end. The word curse kept rattling around in my brain, but I honestly was having trouble seeing it as a curse. As I lay next to my wife that night, I imagined outliving her and our son. Maybe that was the curse. Maybe Howard had watched the people he loved die over the years. Maybe that was the terrible part. I mulled it over for a week before I finally gave him my answer. We were taking them out for cell cleanup, and as Howard stood there, ankles chained and hands cuffed behind his back, I moved next to him to ask my question. So, say I wanted to take this power. How do we do it? He smiled, knowingly. I've been thinking about it for a while, huh? Well, yeah, you have to admit it's a tempting offer. He nodded, but said nothing. So how does it work? I asked impatiently. We shake hands, and you say, I take this burden unto myself. That's it? I asked incredulously. That's it, he said. He turned to look at me then, and the look in his eyes should have told me all I needed to know. His face was calm, but his eyes were hungry to be rid of this curse. His eyes burned with a secret desire, a desire unknown to anyone who hadn't been trapped in a cage like he had. His whole body seemed to vibrate as he extended his hand. If I hadn't been so eager, no, greedy is a better word. If I hadn't been so greedy, I would have seen the look and never come close enough to touch him again. Instead, I reached out and shook his hand without a second thought, saying the words exactly as he had said them. I take this burden unto myself. That is when the most intense feeling of vertigo I had ever felt hit me. My vision doubled, tripled, swam like a pool of turbulent water. For a minute that was locked in eternity, I could feel my very being as it was siphoned from me and spat back by a giant lung. I was turned into a tornado, bottled in a jar, and poured over a volcano. I cannot adequately describe what happened, but when I returned to myself, everything had changed. I was slumped against the railing, head spinning, and vomit dripping between the grating of the catwalk. My hands hurt, and my legs seemed sluggish. I could hear voices asking if I was okay, but my tongue didn't want to work properly when I tried to respond. As my vision cleared, I was again struck by an odd sense of vertigo as I saw myself coming up from my knees. I stood up and shook my head, testing my hands and looking over at myself as I leaned against the rail. I tried to reach out, but my hands were stuck behind me. I took a step towards myself, but my legs came up short, and I fell on my face on the metal grating. My nose broke, and I was aware of the second most excruciating pain in my life. I rolled over, spitting blood, and I could see myself standing over me. When I smiled, I felt cold horror spreading over me. Howard's smile was spreading across my face. What happened? One of the COs asked, coming out of the cell and looking at Howard as he stood over me. This inmate lunged at me. I had to put him down before he hurt himself, Howard said, never taking his eyes off me. That's so, the CO said. I think his name was Taylor, but who remembers? Want me to call the captain down here so we can start some paperwork? Nah, I think he's had enough. Help me get him back in the cell, Howard said. They moved me back into Howard's cell, grabbing me under the arms. Once the leg restraints came off, they walked out and closed the door. I struggled to my feet and ran to the little window, but Howard was already leaving the quad. Officer Taylor told me to put my hands through the flap so he could get the cuffs off. I tried to explain to him, tried to tell him how I was not inmate Howard, how inmate Howard had put my mind in his body, but the things I was saying were a hard sale at best. Taylor stared at me through the glass, blankly listening to what I was saying in the same way I had listened to 1,000 other inmates. He heard my words, crazy as they sounded, but he let them wash over him before he again told me to give up the cuffs before he had to call the captain down here. I put my hands out, and he took them off. I tried to tell him what had happened again, but he closed the flap and moved on, leaving me in an 8x10 cell with nothing but my own confused emotions. That first night was the worst night of my life. I paced the cell, eating and drinking nothing, as my mind ran around my head like a trapped rat. I hadn't seen Howard for the rest of the day, and it didn't do any good to try to talk to any of the other officers. They just thought I was talking crazy talk to get sent to psych, or ignored me as I raged against the glass. I didn't sleep that night. After lights out, I walked and screamed and yelled my frustration out amongst the other prisoners that screamed for me to shut the hell up. If you've never been inside one of those cells with the door closed, you can't imagine how small it feels. Knowing that you have no escape from that hell is pure madness. Knowing that no one will come if something should happen to you is pure hell. I understand after that night why so many inmates go insane. I worried about my wife and son the most. What if Howard found his way to my house? Wearing my face, my wife would greet him, let him in without question. What would he do to them? Would he hurt them? Thinking like that made me scream all over again, and by morning, I feared my vocal cords had been damaged. The juice they gave me with breakfast helped my raw throat, but did little for my mental anguish. After the first night, I found a numb little hole in my mind to crawl into. That was where I lived for the next few weeks. If someone came to give me food, I ate it. If someone came to take me to the shower, I went. If they tried to take me to rec, I ignored them. I slept in a fetal ball on my mat and just let time slip by. Time had ceased to matter anymore. Sometimes I would sleep the whole day, lost in my misery and coldness. The world shrank to an 8x10 concrete box, and the things outside mattered very little. I could hear whispers on the quad, but I ignored them. My name came up often, my old name, that Howard now wore. No one had seen him in a while, and there was talk that something had happened. I had done something bad, and was likely not coming back. I tried to block it out. I held my hands against my ears and refused to listen. But as the details came out, my worst fears were realized. I had murdered my family. I had shot and killed my wife and son. There was evidence of sexual assault on my wife. Neighbors had heard her begging for her life, heard my son screaming as I killed them. He had left afterwards and killed 5 more people. They had caught him in the act and taken him alive. His trial was scheduled for later this month. He was likely to get the death penalty. This information trickled in over the course of weeks. I was privy to it, but did not actively participate. I stopped eating, my eyes constantly running at the thought of my family's suffering. My wife, my son, they were both lost forever. They had died believing that I was their killer. My greed had led to their deaths. As I lay there, I realized I couldn't take the pain. I tried to kill myself the next night. The officer on duty found me hanging from a bed sheet and cut me down, rushing me to medical. It was needless. I had suffered no ill effect. I had never even lost consciousness. Howard had been right. My body refused to die. I could have cut myself, stabbed myself, thrown myself off the bunk, and never even suffered a bit of ill. I had gained the power I wanted, and now I saw it for the curse it was. I spent a week under medical observation, sitting in a 12x12 concrete room with a big glass window that they could monitor me through. I was dressed in an oversized green smock with Velcro fastenings and given a rip-resistant mattress to sleep on. They gave me pills for the pain, pills for the psychosis, pills for the depression I was likely suffering from, but I didn't take them. I spit them out the second they weren't looking and wallowed in my pain. After a week, they let me go back to my old cell. When I got back, I heard someone calling my name from the nearby window of J-Dorm, Stragview's death house. I bristled when I heard it, the voice as familiar as my own name. I went to the window and looked out across the short expanse. The cell, as if predestined, faced the wall of the death house, and I could see a grinning face looking through the bars at me. The face was a little ragged, a little haggard, but I would have known it anywhere. I was looking at myself. He spent the rest of his time at the back window, trying to get my attention. I had seen inmates do this when I was an officer, talking to each other through the back window grate, but I lay on the floor and ignored him as he called to me. He tried to goad me, telling me how he'd screwed my wife, how my son had cried when he'd beaten him, how they had both suffered before the end. I just lay there and ignored him. He told me about the gas station he'd turned into an abattoir after that, using my own shotgun to kill 3 customers and a clerk. But I went right on ignoring him. He told me how he'd killed a cop before they'd apprehended him, how the cop had wanted to kill him so badly. Told me how the trial judge had said that life was too good for someone like him. But I went right on ignoring him. I've been sentenced to death. I have no attorney, no appeals to file, no chances for retrial. I doubt I'll last more than a year on death row before they execute me. Looks like I finally get to die. I ignored him. He tried to get my attention at every available moment. He told me of the murders again and again. He told me how his life story had been a lie. He told me how he, too, had been a guard once, how he had taken the same deal and been trapped for years and years as his sanity eroded away. You'll sit here, too. In Stragview, no one seems to care about an eternal prisoner. I ignored him until the day they took him off the block and led him to the chair. I was there on the night they executed him. I did not watch from the window. I lay on the floor of my cell in a fetal ball and did not mourn the passing of my old life. I almost thought I could hear him laugh as the lights dimmed and then they came back up again. I was still there when the sun came up. I was there for a lot more sunrises after that. I don't know how long ago that was. Time had no meaning there. Time had no meaning to those trapped in hell. I ate when I had to. I showered when such was offered. I went to rec when it came my turn. The faces of my wife and son faded from my mind, and for that, I was grateful. Their memories are a fiery brand against my soul, and I know I will be made to answer for them someday. I'm writing this from a library terminal in a city I never bothered to learn the name of. I lived on the streets in much the same way I lived in prison. I eat when food comes my way. I sleep when I can find a safe place to. I shower when such things come to pass. Unlike prison, however, I find myself at rec a lot more often. You must realize by now that if I'm out, someone made the same deal I did. I, however, did look back when I left him in that hell forever. His confusion was familiar, but I never looked back again. I kept running, kept moving, and now I feel my sanity beginning to return. It's easy to forget what hell is like once you're out. So if you work in Stragview and an inmate offers you immortality, do yourself a favor. Tell him to shut the hell up and just keep walking. I'm still shaking. I can't believe what I've been a party to tonight. I was told to record, so I did. I didn't know how it would all shake out. How could I? Now I'm facing an investigation and may even have to go to prison myself. All because the bastard told me to keep recording. I work as a correctional officer in Stragview Prison. As a male, most of my time is spent working in close management dorms or serving on special teams within the facility. For those who have never worked in a prison, close management is the kind of dorms you usually see on TV. Every cell is an 8x10 box where 2 men sleep per cell, with bunk beds set into the walls and doors that roll shut at night. I work the night shift, so life is usually pretty straightforward. After lights out, your charges are locked away until chow time in the morning. Other than hourly wellness checks to make sure that, no one's in distress, Your hardest decision is which inmate to shake down for books or which corner to nap in until it's your turn to do a round. Our captain, Captain Rosend, is a nice enough guy who doesn't usually make our lives too hard. He's hard when he has to be, but he doesn't sweat the small stuff. I've seen him hold his ground in an emergency, standing against a quad of unruly inmates even when weapons were present. He's been my captain for about a year now, and my shift honestly couldn't have asked for a better one. On Monday, he wasn't the one to greet us after we'd had our bags and pockets checked in the security room. The captain that held our roster for the evening was a stranger. He had a head of thick, wiry gray hair and a beard to match. His thin build teetered on emaciation, and he had a pair of stormy eyes that seemed to be roving the crowd constantly. The group of COs that stood around the waiting area were utterly cowed by his menacing appearance. Even some of the sergeants seemed to be giving him a wide berth. "I am Captain Peterson. Captain Rosend is ill tonight, and I am his replacement." His words had a quality that made me uneasy. He sounded like an old general in a war movie, addressing his troops just before all hell broke loose. He gave us our dorm assignments, and we all left in clumps as we discussed how odd he was. Sergeant Dack, the assigned yard sergeant for the night, was incredibly nervous about the prospect of having to work with him all night. He joked with the confinement sergeant, a mousy guy named McCann, that he might just come help him with paperwork instead. Turned out, there were a lot of us doing paperwork before the night was over. The night went by mostly as expected. Mail was handed out before first count. Master roster was concluded before lights out to ensure that everyone was present and accounted for. By 10:30, we had all of our inmates snugged in their cells. I was just deciding which counter to prop my feet up on when the phone rang. Dotson, the sergeant assigned to the dorm with me, rolled his eyes at it before saying to me, side-mouthed, "Sounds like this is the moment they've decided to get up to shenanigans." The statement would prove to be prophetic. It was Dak. He wanted an inmate from Quad 3, inmate Garman, in leg shackles and hand restraints to be brought down to the captain's office ASAP. Dotson nodded as he relayed this information to me, rolling his eyes theatrically. I started assembling the necessary items we would need to outfit Garman for his trip. When Dotson hung up, I asked him why they wanted Garman so late at night. Dotson only shrugged. "Dunno. Do you mind taking him, though? I'm up to my tits in paperwork, and I really need to get caught up." I agreed and went out to Quad 3 to get Garman ready to go. Garman was not happy about being rousted. Garman was in his late 30s, his short brown hair growing prematurely gray, with the thin, stoop-shouldered look common in inmates. He wanted to know what all this was about, and why they wanted him so late, and just how long this was going to take, and he wanted to know it all right now. I told him that Captain wanted to talk to him. If he had questions, then he'd better take it up with him. That seemed to finally get him into motion. When the captain called, it was never a good idea to keep him waiting. He balked again when I told him he'd have to wear the ankle chains, but at this point, it was just grumpy bluster. We got his hands secured behind his back, his leg restraints in place, and I called him in over the radio as Dotson buzzed us out onto the compound. The compound at night is probably the most peaceful place in the world. Prisons are almost always set up to be out in the middle of nowhere, and it seemed to be by design. When the lights go out and the children go to bed, the dorms look almost peaceful. The crickets and the night birds were the only sound around us as we walked. I saw Garman look around and take it all in, with the kind of resignation only the incarcerated can manage. We often forget when we put on the uniform that some inmates are still human too. Not all of them get to keep their humanity here, but some of the lucky ones are strong enough to not let this place turn them into animals. Some officers are lucky enough to keep that humanity too. The captain's office is a square concrete building in the middle of the compound. It's close enough to every dorm that you could run to someone's aid in about a minute from the front door. Dak was waiting for us when we arrived. He was usually a good-natured fella, quick with a joke or a sarcastic remark. Tonight, though, he was standing over a little pile of crumpled cigarettes, and he looked haggard. He looked up at us as we approached and threw something to me that I almost dropped. It was the video camera that we used for disturbances. Anytime an inmate needed to be put on camera, you could bet that he was about to have a bad time. I had run the camera a few times, mostly to monitor inmates after they'd been sprayed with gas or slammed to the ground. I knew enough to figure out that this wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. "What's this for?" Dak took a long drag off his Winston and added it to the pile. "Cap wants the meeting recorded." "Any particular reason?" I didn't like seeing Dak this short and out of sorts. No clue, but would you please do it? Peterson, Cap, I don't want to spend any more time in there with him than I have to. Why? What's going on, Dak? I'm going to confinement to help McCann with paperwork. Come find me when you're done, okay? Dak, what the hell is going on? Dak looked at me, and I could tell for the first time that he was scared. That guy, he's not right, man. I don't know what it is, but I know that I don't want to spend any more time with him than I have to. Just do this for me, will you? Please? And it was the please that really did it for me. I told him I would, and Dak slumped off towards confinement. I walked Garmin in and knocked on the front door of the captain's actual office. The outer room held a computer, a copy machine, and a couple of filing cabinets that usually held people's lunch boxes or the crap that officers took from inmates. The outer office was empty, which was a first. Usually the place was full of officers and sergeants who had escaped their dorms to hang out with their friends at the captain's office. The absence of other officers should have been a second red flag, but I shrugged it off and knocked on the door a second time. "Come in," said Captain Peterson. When I came in, he was finishing up a phone call. His eyes got big when he saw Garmin, and he lost his train of thought for a second. Garmin stood before his desk, unimpressed with the wild gray gentleman who sat behind it, and looked around the office as Peterson finished his phone call. Peterson dragged his eyes away from him with difficulty and turned his attention back to the phone. No, Mary, I have to go. Yes, I intend to go through with it. Don't worry. After tonight, it won't matter. I love you too. Good night." And with that, he hung up the phone. He reached around it and unplugged the cord, rising from the desk as he did so, and walking around to look at me. He stood much too close to me, and I could almost smell his sweat as he bent to look me in the eye. His sweat did not smell altogether healthy. "Do you know how to operate that?" he asked, indicating the camera. "Sir, yes, sir," I said, trying not to let him hear my discomfort. "I want you to record our interview. I want you to record, and I don't want you to stop. No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, no matter what inmate Garmin or I might say, I want you to keep recording. Can you do that?" That made me nervous. What had I walked into? Garmin did not seem too keen on our conversation either, but since he was the one in restraints, he didn't really have a lot to say on the matter. As I stood there, the captain's manic gaze fixed on me, I found myself nodding and opening the camera to begin. I pushed the button labeled record and moved back a little to frame the scene for whoever was going to watch it later. The captain stepped out of frame and locked the door. Then he sat behind his desk, and for a moment the two just stared at each other. "Do you know who I am, inmate?" "You're the captain, right?" Garmin scoffed. Captain Peterson mulled this answer over for a minute. He sat behind the desk, leaning in to look at Garmin, and I took the advantage of the lull to take a step back into one of the corners, so the two were both in frame. Garmin standing before the desk, and Pearson sitting at it, were easy to get into shot. I wanted everything in sight for whatever reason I was recording this. I didn't want anyone to claim something afterwards that I didn't get on tape. Peterson chewed over Garmin's answer, and it didn't seem to satisfy him. "Do you know who I am?" he asked again, something unsettling creeping into his voice. "Look, Cap," Garmin said, rolling his eyes, "if you called me down here to play games, then let's just skip the crap, and you tell me." Both Garmin and I jumped as Peterson slammed his hands down on the desk. When he looked back up, his eyes were full of terrible knowledge, and when he spoke, his voice was full of barely controlled rage. "Do you know who I am?" he bellowed, spit flying into Garmin's stunned face. Garmin stood petrified, and Peterson was forced to answer his own question. "My name is Frederick James Peterson, you piece of human garbage. Does that ring a bell?" Garmin stammered a little, but seemed unable to answer. "You were convicted of murder. Isn't that so, inmate Garmin?" "Yes," Garmin stuttered, a big glob of spit sliding down his cheek as he tried to speak. "Your record says murder, but that's not the whole story, is it, Garmin?" Garmin didn't answer, but Peterson didn't seem to require one.
I bet not too many of these other fellas know why you're here, do they, Garmin? You tell them that it's for murder. Maybe you were wrongly convicted after defending yourself. We know better, though, don't we? You see, you're a child killer, aren't you, Garmin?
No, Garmin breathed, wincing out the words as though they might hurt him to think about. The captain moved quicker than I would have thought him capable. One moment he was sitting, and the next he was up and over the desk. Garmin's head snapped to the side as Peterson's open palm connected with his face. He staggered back, startled and hurt, but kept his feet in the face of the grinning apparition who now sat atop the desk.
Don't you dare lie to me, you piece of shit! You were convicted of murdering 13 children between the ages of 9 and 13, weren't you?
When Garmin didn't answer, he hit him again, and this time I saw a line of blood dribble down his chin as he brought his head back up. I took a step forward, meaning to stop this. Peterson fixed me with a crazed eye, though, and I took a step away again. Those eyes told me plainly not to get involved, not to come between them. He didn't want to hurt anyone but Garmin, but he would if I got in his way.
Didn't you?
He shouted, and this time Garmin looked up. Yeah, that's right. I'm a child killer. I'm a child murderer amongst murders. So what? He asked, blood spattering out of his mouth onto the captain's uniform. Peterson hit him again, but it was no open-hand swing this time. He hit him full in the face with a closed fist, and this time Garmin's blood pattered across the floor in a torrent. He cried out, high and pathetic, and Peterson turned his face towards him as he drank in his anguish. I thought again about stopping this, but Peterson's display had scared me into submission. You don't often see someone in authority, at least not someone in this line of work, lose their cool so utterly and so quickly.
That's right, Garmin. You're a child killer, but that's not all there is to it, is there? You didn't just murder them, you abducted them.
Garmin gagged on his own blood, but still managed to shake his head in negation. Peterson hit him again, and this time I heard his jaw pop as Peterson's fist flashed across it. He hit him 3 more times, a quick 1, 2, 3 in succession. When his head came to rest, I feared his jaw might be broken.
Don't you dare lie to me, Garmin. You abducted them, you tortured them in your basement, and killed them as they hung crying from your rack. You sit in the chow hall, in the library, laughing with your little friends on the quad, and all the time you know what you are. You know that you deserve to die for what you've done.
Garmin had hunched down, trying to cover himself as the captain lunged at him again. Instead of his fist, however, he put a boot in his guts and sent him sprawling against the filing cabinets in his office. I heard his head connect with the metal box and saw the bright spray of red as his scalp broke open. I lowered the camera and tried to go to him, tried to stop this from escalating any further, but Peterson shoved me away and screamed at me to keep recording. The camera shook as I lifted it again. I wanted to stop. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to leave the two alone. I realized now that my presence meant very little to him. I was merely a means to an end.
At your trial, I sat in the gallery and prayed that someone would grant you the death that you so deserve. I prayed and prayed that you would feel the terror of waiting on the needle, right up until they slid it into your veins. I wanted you to suffer as I had, as my Catherine must have before you.
But at that, he took the inmate's shoulders and slammed him into the cabinet again. The blood flew then. Garmin's blood splattered onto the cabinet and flew onto the walls. I imagined I could see his skull beneath the torn scalp, and as I sank to my backside on the floor, I could do nothing to turn aside.
My Catherine was beautiful. She was pure, and you took her from me. Then that soft-hearted judge gave you life. Life in prison. Did you give my Catherine life? No, you ended her life. I've looked for you for the last 5 years so I could give you the same thing you gave her. Finding you became a sort of mania in me, you see. When my wife left me, when my friends stopped calling, when my son went to live with her because he couldn't stand to see what Catherine's death had done to me, I blamed you and added just one more sin to your tally.
As he stood,
He took his frustration out on Garman. The man was limp, unconscious if not already dead, but Peterson went right on abusing him. He punched him, he stomped him, he slammed his head and stomped his fingers. And by the end, the man looked like clay that had been worked over by an untalented child. I am your judge, Garman, your judge, your jury, and your executioner.
Garman's blood had coated the overhead light, bathing the room in a pool of red. The spreading pool of blood from Garman accentuated the room. Peterson hunched over Garman's body, panting like a dog as Garman slowly bled his life away. He rose, graceless, and turned to glare at me. His face was a mask, stained with blood and pits of viscera. He looked like an angry god, like some old totem unearthed by a violent storm, and as he approached, I was filled with a deep and resonant fear. He loomed over me, and I could see him putting those fists to work on me as I sat hunkered in the corner. He bent and took the camera from my numb hands. Then he left through the door, pushing it open and walking from the office like nothing had happened. That was, 12 hours ago. I sat in the office hyperventilating as the phone began to ring. I let it ring. I had no strength left after what I had witnessed, and the phone going unanswered brought Dak back to the office. When he saw Garman slumped across the cabinet and covered in blood, and me cowering in the corner, he called the major. The police arrived shortly after that, along with the warden, the inspector, and internal affairs. I told my story repeatedly. By the 8th retelling, I felt ready to scream. No camera footage existed of the events in his office. He unplugged the camera in the ceiling, and the only footage on file is me bringing Garman from the dorm to the office. Dak told me that Cap had wanted to speak with Garman, and Dotson corroborated the call. That took my name off the top of their list, but it still didn't answer where Captain Peterson had gone. Captain Peterson, as it turned out, was the father of Catherine Peterson. Catherine had been Garman's last victim, and the victim that had finally seen him caught. However, Garman had information about a child sex ring that he had been selling tapes to in exchange for a lesser sentence. Garman had assaulted many of his victims on camera, and the videos had been netting him a high profit with that particular brand of pervert. He flipped on them, which allowed his record to say nothing about how he had murdered children. A dozen perverts off the street and one murderer behind bars for life was probably a fair trade in the court's eyes. Captain Peterson, though, had disagreed. They still haven't found Captain Peterson or the video camera. There's no footage of him leaving the facility, and the only way to get in and out is through the front gate. That means he's still on the compound somewhere. He's still there, maybe plotting violence against another inmate, perhaps just reviewing the footage like a scholar studying catechism. I had no choice, you understand. I had to keep filming. Even if I had stopped, it wouldn't have changed anything. The inspector didn't like that answer, but you see the truth of it. As I lay in my bed now, I can see the last image of Peterson superimposed behind my eyes. I see that blood-stained man coming towards me, and I wonder if I've indeed seen the last of him. Work release isn't like an ordinary prison. If you're unfamiliar with how the prison hierarchy works, let me explain. You have maximum security institution, places with barbed wire on the fences and men in cages inside concrete structures, whose days are basically dictated by the guard's will. Then you have minimum security, which is mostly dorms that look like summer camp cabins, bunk beds, belongings stacked neatly in lockers, and inmates who have a schedule to go about their day as they choose, within reason. Then there's community custody, which is more like a halfway house. Inmates living in community custody have jobs outside the facility. They earn their own money, and they get to wear regular clothes most of the time. They have one foot in the real world and usually cause very little trouble. This post is deemed too dull for most officers, but after 3 years of running and gunning at Stragview, I was ready for something a little more boring. The major that runs the Midnight Ridge work camp is a friend of mine, you see. He heard I was looking for a change and decided to make me part of his team. So I put in my transfer, waited my customary 3 months for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn, and finally got my marching orders. I thought that after 3 years of hassle and bullcrap, I had finally arrived at a sort of early retirement. I had no idea. There are 3 shifts at work release. The first shift handles the morning, the busiest time of the day, and organizes the vans and the carpools that take our inmates to work. They monitor their GPS tracking and generally field phone calls and questions from the brass or family members. Second shift was responsible for the logistics of bringing everyone home, coordinating arrivals, making sure that by the time third shift arrived at 11, everyone was snug in bed and dreaming about tomorrow's workday. That's where my shift comes in. Third shift was by far the easiest of the 3 shifts. You sat behind a desk for 8 hours and watched the GPS points run for the day on a big monitor. You monitor phone records, call in counts to the control room, and try not to fall asleep. Other than that, not much happens. Third shift is also the only shift with just one person on it. That's because you don't have to deal with anyone until the sun rises, unless there's an emergency. I had ridden the 11 to 7 for about 3 months, and I had to say, it was the best post I'd ever had. I had to run chow at 4 a.m. and send 3 groups of loggers out at 5:30, but other than that, I rarely ever even saw an inmate unless I wanted to. That's probably how I lost my focus. I was out on a compound check when I first noticed the sound. Every night at midnight, I have to walk the compound and make sure that everything is locked up. Aside from the 2 dorms, there's a tool shop, a laundry room, a chemical shed, a motor pool, and a lawn shed where we keep the lawnmowers and weed eaters. It's also important to walk around to make sure the grounds are free of garbage and that no one's tried to drop off any care packages during the day. I've been told that sometimes people will do drug drops when all the inmates are at work, so we walk around periodically to check the drainage ditches and look for turned up turf that someone's hidden something under. So, I was walking the ground with my headphones in, listening to Spotify as I made my way around. That's when a harsh noise cut into the music. It sounded like TV static, or the high ree of power lines. I took my headphones off and cleaned the jack, thinking that that was the culprit. Once I had them off, though, I realized that they weren't the culprit. The sound was coming from the yard. Figuring that it was an extra energetic cicada, I kept making my way around as I tried to find the source. By the time I had checked the last shed, the noise had stopped. I walked back in and set about the difficult task of finding something to watch on YouTube in between my hourly rounds. An hour later, I was sitting with my feet on the desk and listening to a creepy reading when something caught my eye on the security monitors. Most of the compound is wired with cameras. You've got one in the control room, one in the kitchen, one in each dorm, one in each of the sheds, and 4 that sit in various locations around the outside. One of them faces the only road in, another one sits on the parking lot, and the other 2 face the rec yard and the backwoods. I looked at the cameras again, sure I had seen something blip across the back cameras, and nearly flipped out of my chair as I caught sight of something on the rec yard. Someone, I guess, would describe it better. They were standing in the rec yard, right in the middle of the basketball court, and looking at the woods. The center had once been a lumber camp, and it's pretty far back in the woods. There's only one access road, and I hadn't seen anyone drive up it. We don't get a lot of foot traffic out here, being about 5 miles from the nearest road, but we do get visitors from time to time. The signs on the road are usually enough to deter anyone that wants to come this far, so the idea that someone had just walked out of the woods and onto my rec yard this late at night was a little hard to believe. I unlocked the cage where we kept the shotguns and headed out nonetheless. It wasn't an inmate, they were all locked down for the night, so it had to be someone from outside the camp. I came out of a side door, barrel leading, and peeked around the edge to get an idea of what I was dealing with. They were still there all right, staring at the woods as they stood out on the blacktop. They were tall, around 6 feet, with a hood that obscured their face. The spotlight on the court showed me jeans and sneakers, and I began to think it might be a man. As I took in his profile and sized him up, I started to hear that high-pitched buzzing noise again. It followed me as I crept closer to the tool shed, and I had to squint as it seemed to buzz against my fillings. It was worse than before, the sound sliding across my mind like an ice skate, and as I swung around to challenge the man, I could feel my left eye twitching from the noise. I leveled the barrel at him as I challenged him in my loudest voice, the words stilted as that loud ree raked across me. "This is state property. You are not authorized to be here. State your business before I point my shotgun at an empty basketball court." I swept the barrel around, trying to listen for footfalls or heavy breathing. The guy had been there 1 minute and been gone the next, so if he were still here, I should be able to hear him. There was nowhere he could have made it in the couple of seconds it had taken me to come around the shed, and I was certain he had to be here somewhere. I'd seen him. The camera had seen him. And as I started walking around the shed, I tried to flush him out, challenging him every few minutes as I did so. It took a minute for me to realize that I could have heard him at all, because the loud ringing had disappeared from my ears. 30 minutes later, I had to accept that he had gotten away. The cameras, though. I made my way back to the control room, opening the door with my key, and sat down in front of the camera bank. I should have called Stragview, which is only about a mile up the road, but I wanted something more concrete than my word on it. The fact that he had disappeared had shaken me, and I needed someone else to have seen him. I rolled back the footage by an hour, panning forward slowly as I checked for figures. Maybe the cameras would show me where he'd gone to. I could go back out and find him, cover him until backup got there, and have a little excitement for a change. When I got to the point where I had noticed him on the camera, though, the blacktop was empty. I kept watching, thinking maybe I'd been wrong about the time, but when I rounded the corner with my shotgun a few minutes later, I rewound and looked again. There was no one there. The court was empty, until I got there at least. But I know I'd seen someone on camera. Hell, I'd seen him there when I rounded the shed. How could he have just gone? There was no more YouTube for me that night. I bird-dogged those cameras, my eyes sliding from screen to screen, trying to catch anything that might vindicate what I'd seen earlier. I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen a person out there, but there was nothing there now. The longer I went, though, the more I second-guessed myself. Maybe it had been a shadow. Perhaps I'd been seeing things. Maybe I just wanted there to be something out there. I was looking at the yard when something blipped near the woods. I was used to seeing raccoons and possums as they went about their business. Maybe even an owl or a hawk. But whatever this was, it had been big. I panned around to the other cameras and thought I saw a similar large shape loping near the woods. It was too big to be a dog, maybe a mastiff, but I suppose it could be a large cat or something. We did get bear and cougar sightings every now and again, but this was too weird, especially on top of my prowler. When the courtesy phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The guy on the other end sounded as scared as I was. "Officer, it's Tabish in A-Dorm. We got a problem out here." The courtesy phone was how the inmates contacted me after the doors were locked. If one of them had a medical emergency or a fight broke out, that was how they got in touch with me. I had only heard it ring a few times, and mostly it was because I was late opening the doors for chow. Today, however, the guy on the other end sounded pretty scared. As scared as I felt, in fact. "What's going on?" I asked. "Well, something big ran past the window, like a cougar or something. Now there's something loud on the roof. Sounds like it's trying to get in." "The roof? What's on the roof?" "I don't know, sir. It sounds pretty big, and it's..." But suddenly there was a loud ripping sound from overhead, and I heard Tabish scream as it was overtopped by the ringing I had heard earlier. I slammed the phone into the cradle and picked up my shotgun as I turned towards the dorm. It took me 2 steps, though, for logic to rear its ugly head, and I realized that charging off without letting someone know was going to be a great way for me to end up dead. I picked up the phone again, dialing the number for the control room of Stragview, and praying that they hadn't had some kind of problem as well. Someone picked up on the second ring. "Stragview Reception Center, Control Room Officer Cleese speaking." I gave Cleese a short rundown on what was happening, and he assured me that he would send some officers out to help me. "Just don't leave the control room. Lock the doors and stay put until we get there. ETA is about 15 minutes, but it could be a half an hour. We're majorly understaffed tonight." "Do I need to call the police as well? Maybe the..." "No!" Cleese came back quickly and decisively. "We will handle this. Stay put and don't do anything stupid." Then he hung up on me, and I could swear I heard that weird static creeping in again through the line. I went around and made sure the doors were locked and tried to keep myself from moving towards the back. I was very curious about what was going on in the dorm, and I found myself walking towards the kitchens before I could think about it. I should, after all, go and make sure the kitchens were secured. It backed up onto the rec yard, and the dorms were beyond that, so if the doors weren't locked, something might get in, right? I had just slid the key into the lock that separated the offices from the kitchen when I heard the frantic pounding of fists. I threw the door open and saw a handful of scared inmates at the back door to the kitchen. They were pounding on the glass hard enough to send cracks running through it, and some of them were looking behind with terrified, jerky glances. Some of them stepped back when they saw the shotgun, but started pounding with more fervor when they saw I was the one holding it. "Please, let us in. These things out here are going to kill us." I glanced out back over the top of the drop sink and saw an abattoir spreading across the blacktop. The overhead lights near the woods and over the blacktop had burst, casting the whole space in a moonlight shadow. I could see large, loping creatures chasing scared inmates in the semi-darkness before burying them and savaging them with huge jaws. Their screams were a cacophony that I was surprised I was only now hearing, and many of them lay dead and bleeding across the blacktop. In the middle of it all stood a hooded man. He stood there amidst the chaos, taking it all in mildly from beneath his black hood. The beasts moved around him, long chitinous bodies moving gracefully, and I almost sensed his approval of it all. Had he brought them here? Were these his pets? My mind tried to make sense of it all, even as that skeletal reeing drove an ice pick into my brain. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine through the window, and I heard the screams dim a little as though someone had turned down a radio. His eyes bore into mine, and I could feel him root around in my brain like fingers over my scalp. The inmates at the door kept shrieking, but I hardly noticed when something came along and dragged them away. Many of the things seemed to be dragging my inmates towards the woods, but the man in the hood commanded my full attention. When he spoke in my head, it didn't even seem that odd. "We don't want you, watchman. Sleep, and live to tell your friends what you've seen here. Oh, and be sure to give the warden a special message from me. Be sure to tell him that Reese sends his regards." Then that loud ringing reached a fever pitch, and I felt warmth trickling down the side of my head. My knees cut loose, and I split the left knee of my uniform pants as I crashed to the kitchen floor. I was suddenly assaulted by the loudest ringing I had ever heard, and it felt like a bolt of lightning was rocketing around in my skull. Fortunately, I didn't have long to suffer. I blacked out just as my hands came up to try to cover my bleeding ears. I wasn't aware of anything else until someone slapped me across the face, and I realized I was on the ground. They brought me to the prison and tossed me in a holding cell. That's where I'm awaiting the warden while he compiles the report from the work camp. From what I was told by the yard sergeant, a blunt man who came to interrogate me like a freaking inmate, all the inmates at the center are gone. I told him about the things, about the men, the bodies, and the blood out on the rec yard, but he didn't believe me. The sergeant said they hadn't found any bodies or blood there. The only person they found was me, asleep on the floor after making a disturbing call to the prison about someone attacking the work camp. The doors to the dorms were open, the locks missing, and they expect that there is now a roving band of inmates in the Stragview woods. The only person that seemed to believe me was the warden. He met me at the gate, asking me what had happened and what I had seen. I told him everything. I told him about the big creatures, like hunting cats, that had broken into the dorm, and the blip on the camera I'd seen as they moved around. I told him about the phone call from the inmate Tabish, where he had told me about the creatures that were trying to get into the dorm, and the static bursts as they made their way inside somehow. I told him about the man in the hood, even giving him the message that he had left for him. That was when the warden's carefully constructed cool had evaporated. "Hold him until I get back. I will have more questions for him." So here I sit to await my fate, thinking about the man who came to threaten the prison, and about the work release job I will likely never see again.